Jane Baston is the co-chair of the Young Greens of England and Wales, and she's going to be joining us right now to talk about the role of the Young Greens within the student movement and the state of the student movement in the UK more broadly. I wonder if you could just explain what you think the role of the Young Greens is right now in the student movement.
Yeah, big question. For anyone watching that doesn't know, the Young Greens is obviously the youth and student wing of the Green Party. And I think kind of our place in particular is about being almost a political voice for the student movement. Obviously, Labour has moved much more to the centre and don't really talk about students, and young people don't seem to care about them that much. And I think for the Young Greens in particular, we want to be there raising the issues and talking about the things that are impacting students. There has been a lot of upheaval for students over the last couple of years throughout the pandemic, from being kind of locked in halls, from having to pay for halls that they weren't able to access, to all of the changes that happened throughout the pandemic. And there's not been a huge number of people speaking for them. And I think that's kind of our place as the Young Greens, is to try and be a voice for those people, and also to kind of push the party as well into talking about young people in particular, and to be talking about the things that are impacting young people and students, because often the things that are impacting the wider population, for example, the housing crisis that's currently going on, or the cost of living crisis, have a particular impact on students. So, for example, cost of living crisis is impacting everybody, but students have been living in poverty for years at this point, because of things like maintenance loans not going up. And it's something that is really having a very acute impact on students in particular. And I think being a political voice for them is really important, and bringing them in as well. I think we also have a place in terms of organising within the student movement. The student movement does a lot of organising, a lot of bringing people together, a lot of grassroots campaigning, and I think we really have a place there as well in terms of supporting that and amplifying it as well. Things like the occupations that are currently happening at the University of Leeds, and I'm sure that there will be others that pop up across the country as well. Showing them solidarity, amplifying their voices. So that's kind of where I would say that we stand at the moment in terms of the Young Greens and the student movement.
So, for people who aren't familiar with the student movement, to give a bit of context, there's a long-running tradition of political organisations, whether they be linked to political parties or otherwise, of working and organising within the structures of the student movement to obtain political office within them, and to organise them um, to gain influence in the formal structures. And by formal structures, I mean things like, for example, NUS, the National Union of Students, or individual students' unions, or in some instances, the kind of more radical organisations on the sort of left fringes of the student movement, and they've historically done so. Often through their own banner. So, for example, Labour Students for a long time was the core organisation within NUS, winning officer positions, and also at Students' Union level, winning lots of positions across the country, and basically having major influence over the student movement through the institutions. The Young Greens over for a long time has kind of struggled to replicate that, and struggled to gain those positions of influence and power within the student movement. Why do you think that is, and is there something changing on that front?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of reasons for this, and I think obviously if we look kind of back in the history of the Young Greens, there have been kind of times where we've had little bits of that kind of that power and that influence. So for example, I think it was back in 2015, 2016, when we had two Young Greens elected to the block of 15 within the NUS. There have been obviously sabbatical officers elected across the country, who are Green Party members, yourself being one, Chris, me also being one, although I will admit that I only joined the party a couple of months before taking up my role as an officer, and it was definitely a spurring moment for me to kind of sign up to the party when I was like, I've got a full-time job. And I think for the Young Greens in particular, I think part of it is that we don't necessarily organise within those structures because we organise outside of them much more. And for us, I think that's partially because we want to change education for the better and we want to improve it. And often that's not possible to do from inside of it. And it's something that I've definitely experienced as an officer myself, as somebody that currently works at a student union as well, changing things like the NUS or things like the Office for Students, abolishing the Office for Students and the way it works and the way that it regulates the sector, or scrapping something like the Education Act of 1994 is not necessarily possible to do from inside the student movement. You can be really angry about it, you can be really loud about the impact that it makes, but the limitations put on things like student unions means that you can't necessarily make that change. And I think for the Young Greens, we're very much have been focused on doing that organising outside of the student movement to change the student movement. So, for example, getting political power so that we can abolish things like the 1994 Education Act, which limits what student unions can do. And I think that's where a lot of our energy has been going into the more electoral political organising, rather than focusing it so much on the internal organising of the student movement itself. I think that's one part of the answer. I think the other part of it is that we haven't had the capacity to do it, and we haven't necessarily had the drive to do it. And I think that's shifting slowly. I would like to think it is. Obviously, our Green Students Committee only restarted. I should know this because I was elected as the co-convener when it restarted 2 years ago. Yeah, pretty sure it was 2 years ago, and is still kind of finding its feet a little bit, figuring out where it fits and what it's kind of been doing. So, for example, it's been running, as you know, Chris, you've come along to some of them, events to support left-wing candidates who want to stand for student union election. We've been doing things like that, but I think there is more work to be done there, particularly around the education piece, in terms of the power that those structures hold. Being a student union officer is an incredible opportunity. It's exhausting. It's great fun. It gives you a lot of power and you can make a lot of change with it. And I don't think that's necessarily something that we've been kind of educating our members about, bringing them in to that side of organising and using those formal structures. So I think it's kind of twofold. And I think in terms of the capacity, I think that is changing. I think we are slowly building up a kind of grassroots Young Greens group who hopefully will go on and take on these positions. We've got some really, really strong Young Green university groups and local groups that hopefully will look at taking up these positions. That's obviously only just started to come back after the pandemic. Group organising was very difficult when it was all online. So I think we're really hoping to kind of push that forward over the next kind of 9 months, and then obviously next execs to pick that up.
So I'm going to come to some questions in the chat in a moment, but I have one final question for you from myself. And so over the last sort of decade, 12, 15 years, the student movement has lost battle after battle after battle when it comes to policies that have attacked students, that have transform the relationship between of students from someone receiving a public service and an education towards being a consumer of a product. You've had the we had the introduction of tuition fees, then you had the trebling of tuition fees, and the trebling of tuition fees again. You've had cuts to maintenance grants, attacks to disabled students allowance, and so on and so on and so on. And the student movement has lost all those defensive battles, even in spite of the mass mobilisation of the student uprising of 2010, 2011. How do you think that the student movement can move beyond this and can get to a point where it builds enough power that it can win not just offensive demands, but can also win a transformation of our education system?
Yeah. Just listening to you read out that huge list of like losses is slightly like gutting, and very kind of, it makes me want to just go and like cry a little bit in a corner, because yeah, it has been gutting really is the only word I have for it, to constantly kind of lose this battle for a better educational system. And I think it's something that we need to acknowledge the fact that we have lost, and the fact that the movement has been very much hollowed out, particularly if you look at things like the NUS and the way that its structures have recently been changed. But I think in terms of how we rebuild that, and I think there is a lot of change going on in the student movement right now, in the way that we view organising, and the way that we do organising as well, and the way that we bring students into that and bring students together. Really interestingly, actually, coming from the NUS itself, and the NUS kind of changing its focus from being more of a political lobbying organisation that's in the ears of kind of MPs and things like that, into trying to build a very grassroots movement of students across the country. I think part of what we need to do is bringing people together, not just in the student movement, but across the country. One of the people that I speak to at the NUS talks about the strategy to bring your nan in, which I really love, about kind of how you bring your parents and your grandparents and those people who may not care about education until their grandchild goes to university. So I think it is partially about building that really kind of wide grassroots movement that is pushing for a better educational system that does serve students, that isn't just about the transactional cost of I pay you money and you give me a degree. I think it's also about changing about how we look at education, and how we look at university degrees in particular, because this is obviously a narrative that very much comes from the Tory government, is the fact that university students are overeducated, left-wing activists, who they probably don't like, or they very definitely don't like. And I think it's about changing that narrative about what education is worth, and why a university degree is so radically transformative for people. I'm not sure if that answers the question at all, but I think it is coming back, and I think it's very much building it from the grassroots level, which is definitely happening at universities across the country. We've seen rent strikes happening over the past couple of years. We've seen more protests from students. We've seen an increasing number of occupations. I know I mentioned Leeds, but Birkbeck, I think, is also fighting back against the cuts that have just been announced to their university as well. And I think it really is about students taking the lead and students building that together into a grassroots movement across the country.
So I'm going to come to some questions from the chat now. For those watching, if you have questions, please do put them on in the chat, or on socials on the hashtag #BrightGreenLive, and we'll get them put to our guests, in this instance to Jane. So I've got a couple of questions that I want to put to you from Ben Samuel. So Ben has asked, what are the current campaigns that the Young Greens is prioritising right now?
Yeah, good question. So we kind of got 3 for this year. So one of them is about electoral reform. So we really want to be pushing for votes at 16, and for better voting systems. Votes at 16 is something that is particularly important to us, to be pushing for local councils to be passing those types of motions, and in Wales in particular, to make sure that under 18s know that they can vote in the local elections. So that's one. The second one is kind of cost of living, as would probably be expected. So pushing for better support for all young people in light of the cost of living crisis. And then the third one that we're looking at is educational reform. So this comes into a couple of different areas. So one is about pushing back against the marketisation of education. So that's looking at things like scrapping tuition fees, reintroducing maintenance grants, making sure that postgraduate researchers are paid properly as well. And then the other side of that is, for us, is looking at schools and colleges, and looking at exams and looking at alternative forms of assessment that we can have. We know that exams are, no matter what Michael Gove says, they are not a good way of assessing people. They really don't reflect what people can achieve. So we really want to be looking this year in particular at what those alternatives are, so that we can start campaigning really strongly for them. So those are kind of our 3 focus areas for this year. But you're welcome to get in touch with our campaigns officer if you want to find out more.
And those campaigns have gone down well with our viewers so far. Finn White says, yay for votes for 16 and boo for exams. We've also had a very retro shout out from Ben Samuel for a former Young Greens campaign. And Hannah Albrook, a previous Young Greens co-chair, will be very happy to see this. But Ben says that they are a big fan of the Save the Bees campaign, which the Young Greens ran getting on about 8 years ago now, I think. I've got another question from Ben, and then I've got some other questions I'd like to come to. So Ben Samuel asks, what is music to your ears as students and young people that you hope to hear from the Green Party leadership?
Oh, I think the best types of conversations that we have with the Green Party leadership are where they come to us and they ask us what the big issues are that are impacting students and young people, and they want to hear it from us in particular. For lots of young people and for lots of students, we often get the case where people try and speak over us and speak for us. And having those types of conversations with the leadership is really, really appreciated. In terms of policy, I really love it when people talk about scrapping tuition fees. I think that's a really big one. I think at the moment in particular, talking about the housing crisis and how it's impacting students, there are numerous cities across the country where students are homeless and students don't have anywhere to live, or they're not able to pay their bills. Recent NUS research has shown that a large majority of students only have £50 left for the whole month after paying their rent and their bills. And that's not acceptable in any way, shape or form to have students living in poverty. So I think those are kind of the 2 big policies, I would say, at the moment, but also anything that is about stopping the marketisation of education, but coming to us and listening to us about what we're experiencing as young people and amplifying our voices is really the key thing from the leadership, which I will say they are very good at doing, and we do really appreciate it when they do that.
So I've got another question, this time from Finn White. So it's a slightly more personal question, I guess. So Finn asks, how do you stay motivated as a young person involved in politics, especially in a political system that doesn't listen to young people very often?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And hi, Finn. Finn's our under 18s officer on the Young Greens exec. So first of all, I get a lot of sleep, I think is a really important thing for me personally. And I think for me in particular, with the work that I do with the Young Greens, the thing that keeps me motivated a lot of the time is the people that I work with. So we have an executive committee who are incredible, and we work with our Democracy and Accountability Committee and our Green Students Committee, and I do a lot of work with our student groups and our university groups and our local groups across the country as well. And being able to go and talk to young people who are active, who are inspired, who are radical in their policies, who are pushing for change, who are organising together, coming together, is I think the thing that really does inspire me. And really does keep me going. I will quite often come to a Young Greens executive meeting after a day of work and feel a little bit grumpy and like, oh, I just want to go to bed. And then 20 minutes later, we'll be laughing on a Zoom call and having a great time, while also discussing very serious Young Greens executive committee business. But it's those types of things that I think really do keep me going. I think the other thing as well is that right now with the Tory government, it can feel really, really difficult to imagine a different type of world and to imagine a better world. And I think knowing that we have young people who can imagine that, who are pushing for that, who are creating for that in the cases of our Young Green councillors, is one of the things that keeps me going, to be able to support them and to push for the type of future that we want, and the type of future that we know that we can have, If only we can get the Tories out of government. Obviously, lots of steps after that, but that's the first one. So yeah, I would say talking with other people and working with other Young Greens is the really big thing for me.
Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, Jane. It's been an absolute pleasure.